from your description of Vesuvius, I wasn't, of Pompeii, I'm not sure what it would be.
Well, but I think you're very close. In what we deal more, or we are more familiar with, is with dealing with infantile aspects of the personality, right? The Freudian Oedipal complex, as we know it, right? The child that is in love with mother, wants to marry her and kill the father, and so on. That has not been in the non-psychotic part of the personality. The understanding of that has not been smashed. It has been repressed. The hostile feelings of the child towards the father and the erotic feelings towards the mother, if we're talking of the boy, have been repressed, but have been preserved in the unconscious just in the same way as the civilization of Pompeii has been buried by the amount of lava that came from the Vesuvius. And you can find that in the transference. You will find that. You will find at a certain point that an adult patient may feel hatefully excluded during a vacation break or a weekend break, transferring onto the therapist his feelings of exclusion that he had when he was a child, and mommy and daddy went to sleep and he had to sleep alone in his bed. That is, those feelings come back, and you can tell in the material that this looks like the Oedipal conflict, but now back in the transference as such, right? That is a primitive civilization. All the pregenital impulses are about primitive civilization, right? I mean, they, for instance, the patient that feels hungry on the weekends and needs to soothe himself eating is bringing back to the surface the kind of feelings that he had as a baby or a little child, the hunger for the breast, let's say. But it's intact. It's buried in the unconscious. It's been repressed. It's not been smashed. Right? Instead, the patient that during a break has all sorts of hallucinations and delusions is bringing back a primitive catastrophe, and will probably never ever have the kinds of feelings that would follow the pattern of either the Oedipal conflict or of a little baby searching the breast. Right? Such a patient could perhaps feel persecuted by little objects that resemble nipples that are being shot at him and wanting to kill him. Well, that would be an example of a primitive catastrophe, not a primitive civilization.
A patient who hallucinates on a break dreams, but would say it's a hallucination, that warriors are coming out of the wall behind her and into her bed.
Right.
And are going to kill her, and she has to get up from the bed because she's afraid of being killed by these warriors.
Right. Well, there you have another example, you see. All the infantile sexuality that Freud described, right, the infantile theories that little children have, belong to a primitive civilization. Little children have the kind of beliefs that thousands of years ago primitive civilizations had, right? They make sense, they are not psychotic, right? When a child thinks that babies come from daddy feeding mommy in a particular way, that's not psychotic, that's a primitive belief, but it makes sense. I mean, you know that as an adult, you know that this is not the way babies are made, but if you listen, you say, well,
it's close.
It's close.
Yeah,
the theory
function.
makes sense,
The
right?
function.
Exactly. Like a primitive civilization may believe that if they dance in a particular way, then most of the time rain happens, and if rain does not occur, then it is because they didn't dance well enough. Well, that's not psychotic, that is a primitive civilization. The scientific civilization understands that rains comes from scientific theories that account for the rain. It's another system of beliefs, but that's not psychotic, it's just primitive, you see. So this is the difference between psychotic part of the personality, non-psychotic part of the personality, and Oedipus stands in the middle. That is, Bion's version of the Oedipus myth helps us understand psychosis.
You had said that there's evidence of that in all of us. What would be the evidence of that in a non-psychotic individual?
I didn't say evidence, I said relics in all of us.
Right.
I didn't say relics, but I
Right.
meant traces in all of us.
Yeah.
Right.
I guess the examples I heard were psychotic examples of the relics.
Yes, right.
What would that be in somebody, a patient who's not actively psychotic?
Well, that's an interesting question. There are moments in all of us, and you don't have to be a patient for that, in moments where you know that your mind is not working properly, that your mind is playing tricks on you, right? That you are seeing something that wasn't there. You walk in the street and you see a person you know, and actually no, you created that. It means you had an hallucinatory moment. That doesn't mean that you are psychotic. It means that there is, alongside with the non-psychosis, there is a relic of, for instance, the ability to hallucinate in all of us. There are moments when you are very tired, you tend to hallucinate.
But what about something that's not necessarily hallucinatory? I think that's a great question, because what about the patient that comes back from the weekend and is stubborn and refuses to participate in the session? You know, kind of you know, it is psychotic in a way, because it's an attack on, sometimes it's an attack on the separation of the weekend, let's say. And the experience can be one of, I have nothing to talk about, there's nothing to talk about, and the patient might spend the whole session without melting, let's say, into being able to talk. And it feels psychotic. I mean, but the patient's not psychotic.
Well,
Would that be an example of the patient being caught in a...
it could be. We would like to know, if we can, when the patient opens up a little bit, what it is that makes him not want to talk, right? If the patient has some feeling that we want to strip him of his ideas, right? And I'm now using here an example, the Plandonygus from Bion, that we are addressed to a mind that wants to devour his thoughts or his ideas, then the patient may close down, but the fantasy that we want to strip him of his ideas or his thoughts is in its very nature psychotic, isn't it? When the listening is mistaken for the psychotic version of listening, you want to rip me off all that I know or all that I think, and if I tell you all that I'm thinking, I will remain without thoughts. Well, that's a psychotic version of what communication is about. Does that respond to your question, Julie?
And it could be, I think, as I'm thinking about my patient, is that if she talks, I will create something with her. And it's an attack on the creativity that could happen between us that comes up from time to time. So is that a psychotic part of her personality that's kind of an attack on the awareness of needing the other, the nipple, the breast?
It might be. I mean, if the patient is very paranoid about that, it might well be.
I guess I was kind of surprised that, you know, when you said we've all had kind of that psychotic catastrophe, what I expected you to say was, well, you know, those of us that didn't end up with schizophrenia later in life dealt with it in a Kleinian sort of splitting way, but you haven't said that, and it sounds like there was some real psychotic process going on for all of us when that catastrophe happened.
I think that's the implication, but I say my view, and I'm sure that other people may have a different reading of Bion, but I mean, it doesn't matter. I mean, forget about my view. It's still, what still holds, and I think we would all agree on reading Bion, is his description of the psychotic part of the personality. My version is that it's constitutional in all of us. Other people may say it's not, but that the psychotic part of the personality does what we described, and that the difference between the psychotic and non-psychotic part of the personality is that it deals with reality by damaging the apparatus that perceives reality. That is very clear in Bion. There's no doubt he says it with all his words.
God, it's like at the very beginning, our awareness of reality, when the infant really gets it blasts away the fragile psychic apparatus.
Right.
Just like the Oedipal awareness blasts the infant in some profound way. I mean, that's it.
You're missing one link in the middle.
Uh-huh.
It's not that it blasts, but that the apparatus can't bear it and blasts itself
Yeah, yeah.
to not to have to be aware of that.
Yeah, right.
That's
yeah.
a tiny bit different, you
Yeah,
see,
very important.
because the trauma in this case is a self-inflicted trauma. Don't forget that Oedipus blinded himself. He wasn't blinded, he blinded himself.
It's almost like a reflex. You know, when we say self-inflicted, it makes it sound as if there's an intentional self-attack. It's almost like an automatic reflex of the psyche that just fritzes out almost. I mean, in that initial contact with reality, there's no capacitance in the system yet. There's no way to bear it. And something gets, the circuits get fried initially. Hopefully it doesn't all get blasted. Now, interesting, I know I'm still saying it that way because
Yes.
I'm wondering if it isn't an instinctual response to the exposure of the infant fragile psyche to the reality of reality. I don't know. It doesn't really matter.
I can't argue against that. It may be, but this is not what Bion says.
No, he doesn't. He says
Right?
it's a self-attack. It's
Right. And why? Because Bion, in that sense, is very faithful to Klein's concept of an early ego. Right?
How early?
How early? Since birth, says Klein, if not before.
Yeah. Oh.
Right? But the early ego doesn't mean that our adult egos are there when we were babies. It's not that, not to be mistaken, right? What it does mean is that our adult egos came from the precursors of the egos, and the precursors of the ego were what Klein calls the early ego. But it doesn't look like our adult ego, but it does have the ability